Welcome to the YAHOWAH blog. This is part 9 of our series entitled In the Garden. The purpose of this review of Yahweh's Bereshith Genesis testimony is so that we are better acquainted with the conditions that existed in the Gan Eden, the Garden of Great Joy, because the intent of the Moed Mikra, Yahweh's 7 annual invitations to meet with him, is to bring us back to this very place. And so it's important that you understand what transpired there so you know how to prepare yourself should you want to re-enter. In our last episode, the 8th in this series, we spent a considerable time towards the end of it reviewing what Hasatan had to say about himself in the book of Ezekiel, as he admitted that he was the cherubim in the garden. And during that time, we learned a lot about his duplicity, where Hasatan wanted to present himself as glorious and perfect, and just the paradigm of virtue, if you will, while at the same time condemning the notion of being the adversary, because Satan wants to be worshipped as God. And to do that, he must jettison the title that Yahweh has given to him. And so what we have witnessed is the story of religion, which is role reversal. This is commonly known as replacement theology, or as I prefer to call it, foolology. It isn't only about this misnomer of a Gentile church replacing Jews and Israel, or the counterfeit Jesus replacing the actual Messiah Dode, or even a New Testament replacing the Torah, because it is also about Satan replacing Yahweh as God. After all, what do you think Allahu Akbar actually means? Allah is greater than whom? Well, Satan must obliterate any association with his adversary distinction, because to be perceived as God, he cannot be known as God's foe. Therefore, disguised by other titles and names such as the Lord, G-D, Allah, Jesus Christ, or Hashem, Hasatan attacks the one thing that can hold him back: accurate perceptions of who he actually is. It is a particularly effective tactic because by denouncing the adversary, Satan disassociates himself from that designation and comes off sounding as the religious perceive their God. Since it appears that Hasatan, the adversary, spoke honestly of serving as one of the guardians in the Garden of Eden, as the cherub on the wall, it is interesting to really get a good look at this picture which is emerging. As such, he would have witnessed Yahweh engaging with Adam, loving a man we now know that Satan view as vastly inferior. And this explains why the devil's advocate is called, well, the son of man, or the son of Adam, throughout the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel has him, the Lord, I should say, who inspired the book of Ezekiel, has Ezekiel address him as Lord and Master, while bossing him around and abusing him, forcing him to submit to all forms of BDSM throughout the book. He serves as a revisionist Adam that the Lord and chief manipulator can use as a stooge to present Satan as God. So now we know that Satan did not slither into the garden as a snake. He was already there. He was known, and he was superficially, at least, attractive. He wanted Yahweh to direct her devotion to him, away from Adam, away from Yahweh. He would separate them before misleading them. He has used religion to achieve this same result over the millennia. Digging himself in any deeper, in the 31st chapter of Ezekiel, Satan presents himself as the greatest and most beautiful life form in Eden. And although he perceived himself to be highly valued, beneficial and pleasing, pure and white, he laments the fact that he knows he will be sent down to Sheol, which is hell, the place of separation. In the interim, however, he would live as a titzel, a diminished representation of the Zeroah, the protective shepherd and sacrificial lamb among the Gentiles and non-Israelite nations. That is to say that Satan would impersonate Dowd and thus appear as the Son of God, the Messiah, and as mankind's Savior. In addition, Satan would also admit that he perceived himself as being the most eminent and glorified presence in Eden, its most magnificent and important life form. Then as we progress in the book, we find that Satan referred to himself, as I've shared previously, as a Pharaoh, the leader among the Gentiles, as a man god, if you will, like a monstrous serpentine dragon at times within the seas and the rivers, thrashing about and stirring up muck so that he can set his trap. He even admits that when he's done toying with humankind, he will hurl us away. Confession, I suspect, it's good for the soul if you have one. He even admits that he will fill valleys with humankind's repugnant corpses. He anticipates quenching the flame of life, eliminating the light, even obscuring the sun, which represents, of course, Dowd and his return. Should Satan get his way, darkness will prevail as he will effect the judgment of innumerable people, crippling them while causing the downfall and the demise of humankind. The adversary, after explicitly identifying himself with Babel, confusion, which Yeshayah, Isaiah, does again in the 14th chapter, and associating himself even with Mitzrayim, the place of religious and political oppression, which as we know as Egypt, where the chosen people were enslaved. He speaks of plundering and exterminating the human race. He talks about, even brags about, dragging every soul with him into Sheol. And all the while, terror will be his most prevalent tactic, just as it is his most defining weapon throughout the Quran. And that is why Islam is his preferred religion. Further, in the 33rd chapter of Ezekiel, Saint declares that he will blow a shofar to herald his appearance as the brilliant and the most beautiful, the enlightening Zohar. Satan's identification with the Zohar is so important to him. This connection is repeated throughout the chapter, even though Zohar is the book that forms the basis of Kabbalah, which is the spiritual aspect of Judaism. All the while, the adversary presents those who believe that their God inspired the Zohar as lost and rebellious, so rotten they are seen as decomposing. He has in his book of Ezekiel 25 ways to kill a Jew. In his view, there will be no savior for Yisrael. In recognition of what we have just learned, it is germane to know that the cherubim, are the most important among Yahweh's heavenly host. They are presented in three places. They guard Eden, they protect the Ark of the Covenant, and are shown overseeing the tabernacle and temple. This is where our relationship with God begins, where it is restored. And and where we live with him in his home. Nothing is more important, which is why cherubim are depicted in these places. And they are always plural, except when describing the rogue cherub in Ezekiel. Well, Satan's appearance 6,000 years ago was serpentine and thus convoluted. By virtue of his immortality, which would be the nature of all spirits, and enormous energy, he should not be trifled with as one charms a snake. His words are venomous, and his incantations are toxic. In keeping with the metaphor, Satan infects those who listen to him with a neurotoxin, rendering his victims incapable of fleeing for their lives, paralyzing, blinding, and incapacitating them. So once again, the most recent iteration of such mental and moral paralysis would be Islam. Yahweh's declarative statement is comprised of two elements that collectively form the basis of every religion on earth. Lies are made credible when they are clearly interwoven into a perception of truth. For example, rather than overtly condemn the Torah, rabbis have misrepresented and misconstrued its intent in their Talmud. They even call their Talmud Torah. Even in their Zohar, it alludes to the Torah in the process of elevating Satan's status and appeal. Rather than acknowledging that he had been selected by Satan to undermine Yahweh, Paul claimed that the God he was contradicting had chosen him to be his lone apostle. As a result of, I guess, what many consider to be a clever ruse, Christians would worship Paul's Lord as if Satan were God. They would even identify themselves with the macabre image of a dead God on a stick. Satan's pièce de résistance is the crucifix of Christianity. Similarly, Muhammad fooled billions when he modeled Allah after Satan and then claimed that he was God. And in the end, all three religions would seek to misrepresent Yahweh's witness and overlay it with their own testimony. Clever, perhaps. The fact is, Yahweh created Hasatan, the adversary. God allowed him to come off the wall and enter the garden. He even introduced us to him, describing him so that we would not be similarly fooled by any of these ploys. Then, and this is important, Yahweh allowed Satan to misquote him and to lead thereby. He was even given the people, he even gave, I should say, the people he loved, the opportunity to be beguiled by a twisted portrayal of his testimony and thereby choose poorly to respond in a manner which was hostile to their well-being. Well, now that we know who we're dealing with, here is what the adversary said. Then he said to the woman, "So what if it were true that God said you should not make a habit of eating from any tree in the garden?" Bereshith, in the beginning, Genesis 3:1. So what? Oh my. Well, it sounds audacious to suggest that it does not matter what God actually said, as was the case here. But isn't that what is required for there to be a Talmud, for there to be a New Testament, for there to be a Quran, since each of them go off on their own tangents? So what if God said that? We are now superimposing what we're saying on top of it. And if that weren't bad enough, the religious, like Satan, have felt at liberty to alter God's instructions to fit their agendas. However, God had provided the appropriate guidance. He didn't say what Satan claimed. Remember, then Yahweh Almighty provided clear instruction and direction on behalf of Adam, saying, from every tree in the garden, you can continually and actually eat, enthusiastically being fed and nurtured. But from the tree of the knowledge of good, that which is beneficial, productive, correct, and proper, and bad, that which is ineffective and counterproductive, disadvantageous and unreliable, do not make a habit of continuing to eat from it, because as a consequence, in a day you will die, defined by having eaten from it. That was Bereshith, Genesis 2:17, about a chapter ago. Now that was considerably divergent from the statement that Satan attributed to Yahweh. In scholastic circles, this ploy is called misrepresentation, and it is a form of academic dishonesty. In debate, it is called a straw man, and the adversary's whitewash of Yahweh's word was an accurate paraphrase or counterfeit, which is the most effective way to convince people that the fraud being perpetrated is believable. What may sound similar to the unwary was actually quite different. Compare, then Satan said to the woman, so what if it were true that God said, you should not make a habit of eating from any tree of the garden? To what God actually told Adam, from every tree of the garden, you can continually and actually eat. There were no restrictions placed on Adam. He could eat whatever he desired and saw fit. Moreover, had there been a restriction, the negation was not on eating from any tree, as Satan misrepresented. There was simply a deadly, read venomous and toxic, consequence of being defined by digesting something that would add that which is invalid and disagreeable. There were no constraints, just beneficial results and negative consequences in the options presented to Adam by God. Moreover, Yahweh's instruction was not an, if you make one mistake, I'm going to kill you scenario. A call eating was spoken in the imperfect, which describes ongoing and habitual behaviors. It was parental advice, not a Lord's command. Satan inferred that he, Afki, knew something well beyond his position, which is to infer that his knowledge was superior to Yahweh's. And yet, Satan's approach was off-key, in contrast with God's. He was off-key. On the other hand, the nevertheless upon which this exception and this new condition was being foisted. Born off out of anger, arrogance, and resentment, Satan would inappropriately emphasize that his self-appraisal was accurate, when it was as phony as Paul's epistles, Akiba's arguments, and Muhammad's recitals. No one would be foolish enough to buy a black $6 bill with a picture of a fork-tongued viper. Although most have no problem with "In God We Trust" inscribed on the back of a promissory note and thus debt instrument, depicting a sun god, religion by way of an Egyptian pyramid, and the Eye of Horus calling for a new world order. The beasts associated with Babylon, the religion of Roman Catholicism, the politics of America, and the geography of Islam, deliberately misappropriate God's testimony, as Satan has done here, to infer legitimacy and authenticity. One does not have to be creative to counterfeit, only crafty and cunning, shrewd and strategic. From Babylon to the present day, this tactic has deceived more people and caused more harm than all other ploys combined. It is the essence of Judaism and of Christianity. Now, keep in mind, the closer the lie is to the truth, the more deceptive and beguiling it becomes. It's not to say that Satan's misrepresentation of God's testimony had many words in common. And so it was a reasonably close counterfeit. A counterfeit bill, however, remains fraudulent, even illegal, when it is 99.99% consistent with the original. It artificially gains credibility in the eyes of the unwary through feigned similarity. This is why Jesus Christ was a counterfeit of Dode, rather than an independent or innovative construct. Conceived without the capacity for free will, as is the case with all Malachim and, of course, the cherubim. Satan has always been devoid of creativity. His lone ploy is to beguile by concealing, corrupting, or counterfeiting something God has already conveyed. And that is why the Lord's most popular religions are twisted and plagiarized perversions derived from selectively misappropriating divine revelation. The more they claim the Torah and prophets for themselves, as do Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the greater their appeal to believers, and yet the more obvious their lies become to the observant. It is by making the comparison and showing that the claimed consistency between the Quran and the Torah, between the New Testament and the Torah, and between the Talmud and the Torah, proves that all three religions are deliberate frauds. And that is why I wrote the books called Twistianity, Goddamn Religion, and Babel. Should you be wondering how Satan could have rebelled if he did not have free will? And I'm asked that question regularly. I would encourage you to consider the circumstances under which we have the capacity to choose without the right to do so. For example, the military is a command and control institution, as are Yahweh's Shabat of Malach, the regiment of spiritual implements, where soldiers do not have the freedom to refuse an order. As was the case with Satan, insubordination in the military is unacceptable and is severely punished, with the non-compliant stripped of their rank and incarcerated. People have long chosen to be pedophiles, rapists, arsonists, thieves, and murderers, particularly Muslims, but have never had the right to do so, at least apart from Islam. Yahweh gave Adam and Chawah, and indeed all men and women, free will. We can choose to ignore Yahweh's instructions without penalty. Those who do, like all animals, eventually die. Their souls simply cease to exist. God neither pursues them nor judges them, and assuredly he does not punish them. What was the cause and consequence of the instruction to Adam regarding the tree of knowledge was that in a day you will die. It wasn't that you will be punished. The Malach messengers, however, exist as spiritual envoys. They are God's implements, powerful and persistent tools that he uses to interact with his creation. Similarly, the potter's wheel does not have a life of its own. It does not decide when to turn or what to make. And most importantly, the potter's wheel would be considered broken should it become insubordinate, or worse, claim superiority over the designer using it. Advancing to the second prong of the adversary's plot to mislead Towrah, the serpent suggested, so what if God said? His inference was that Yahweh's words do not matter, that as the Lord and perhaps ours that are equally valid. You know, it's the same thing as people say, well, he's entitled to his opinion. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. We need to respect other people's religions. It's the same ploy that Satan would use to promote Judaism, Christianity, and Islam through Akiba, Paul, and Muhammad, and individual spiritualism generally. What does it matter what God said? All that matters is which is important to you, which you believe. How many times have I heard that? You tell somebody something that Yahweh has affirmed, and they say, well, what I believe is, I don't give a hoot, nor does God. The ploy forms the basis of Catholicism's condemnation of those who are sola scriptura. Popes consider themselves authorized to alter, even completely change God's directions. It is the basis of the oral law, where the claim is that G-D handed the written Torah to Moshe, where the people created their own oral variation. And socialist progressive humanism, aka I call it libertardism, man claims that God never existed, making mankind the ultimate authority and thereby rendering Yahweh's message moot. Well, they render their own message moot too, because they're complete hypocrites. In Islam, Allah was modeled after Satan, so everything Yahweh said was twisted in serpentine fashion. Rabbis were especially cunning, openly claiming Yah's authority for themselves by outvoting and overshouting Yahweh. It became a popular appeal. So what if God set the Shabbat apart? We want Friday or Sunday or the whole weekend, as the case may be. So what if God invited us to observe the 7 Moed Mikre? We prefer Easter and Ramadan and Hanukkah or May Day. We don't really care that they're pagan because, well, that's not what they mean to us. So what if God chose the name Yahweh? We prefer Mother Nature, Hashem, Allah, Jesus, Jehovah, Buddha, or the Lord. If you travel along life's way and you confront a tradition, opinion, or an edict that is somehow attributed to God, ask yourself, did God say this? Or, as the case is with the Talmud, the New Testament, or the Quran, is what is being claimed a corruption or counterfeit of something Yahweh stated through his prophets? In the process of fooling Towrah, Satan exposed a test we can use to avoid being fooled ourselves, because when we compared the adversary's rendition to the Torah's pronouncement, they are different. If they're different, God did not say what Satan claims he said. And that is the basis of my books called Goddamn Religion and Twistianity. I compared what God actually said to what the false gods and false prophets misrepresented him as saying. Now, lingering here just a bit longer on this statement, I find it interesting that most English Bible translations render this passage, Genesis 3:1, as a question, even though there is no interrogatory in the Masoretic text. As a statement, Satan's line suggests that the Almighty doesn't matter, that the adversary isn't interested in soliciting mankind's opinions either. He believes that he is much better informed and smarter than we are. He is not interested in small talk or companionship either. Satan is simply inferring that God's instructions do not matter to him, and by implication, that God's counsel should be of no concern to us. he is exposing the ploy. I should say, he is exposing the ploy he would use to inspire Catholicism, Judaism, and Islam. However, there is the possibility that the interrogatory was removed by the Masoretic rabbis in order to make the statement reflect their own doctrine. The 4Q Gen Qumran scroll renders the text, did God really not to eat from any tree in the garden? Did God really say not to eat from any tree in the garden? Regardless of the format, in debate parlance, Satan has set up a straw man. Since he knows that he cannot prevail on the merits of his case using evidence and reason, he has misrepresented the words of God and thereby presented a foe that he can more easily defeat. While crafty and cunning again, the tactic is disingenuous. It is, however, pragmatic because most people only know enough to be dangerous and they're incapable of disciplined reasoning. Every time I engage a religious individual in debate, for example, this is also their first ploy, and it is an effective means to rebuff critical thinking because there are too few informed and logical people around to properly identify and judge the obvious chicanery. Lastly, there is something notable here that the rabbinical types seem to have missed. If you want to be like Satan, avoid using Yahweh's name. While it has been prevalent throughout Bereshith, Satan did not use it on this occasion because he only wants us to know it when he is claiming it for himself, as is the case throughout Ezekiel. Here, since he is saying, so what if God said, if he uses Yahweh's name, it's obvious he's not Yahweh. But in Ezekiel, the whole point is for the adversary to claim that he is Yahweh. Moving deeper into the narrative, we discover that in her reply, Towrah started off reasonably well, at least up to a point. She relied on God's instructions to counter Satan's initial ploy. But then, as rabbis, Catholics, and Muslims do today, she added her own embellishments, and she lost her way. Towrah's personal indulgences would include the mention of peri, fruit, which was implied but not stated by Yahweh. She left out kol, every, and then she spoke of an etz tree, singular, which was unacceptable, which was the opposite of God's instructions. She located the tree of the knowledge of knowledge without actually naming it, losing sight of its purpose. Then she, following Satan's example, referred to Yahweh by title alone, rather than by name, when both were actually designated in the guidance that Yahweh provided to Adam. The woman, Isha, said to this tempting and toxic creature, Ha, Nakash, the sorcerous snake, this venomous viper, this spellbinding serpent, from the fruit of the tree of the garden we can eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the center of the garden, God said, you should not actually make a habit of eating from it. In addition, you guys should not make contact with it, lest you will have chosen to die. Bereshith in the beginning, Genesis 3:3. Towrah spoke of only one acceptable tree, when God said that all of the trees were nourishing. And by not naming the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, it appears that she never grasped its consequence or its merit. Also, Yahweh said nothing of touching, making this an embellishment, something that is devastating when it comes to God's testimony. Adding our own opinions and our edicts to Yahweh's instructions is expressly contrary to God's Torah teaching, because it is considered a misleading corruption. Moreover, since the paragogic nun suffix on muth die was a variation of the cohortative as an expression of first-person volition, while it may have been true, God didn't say it. It is interesting, however, that pen, meaning lest, is from panah, which means to turn away. And that is the point and consequence of all of this. Towrah's augmentation, while extrapolated from a nugget of truth, took away from the insight that we are influenced by what we consume. Misquoting and misrepresenting Yahweh's guidance leads us away from his actual advice, and that in turn results in our demise. Apart from God, there simply is no life. Now, Yahweh did not say, do not touch the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, because we must closely examine and carefully consider everything to appreciate the difference between right and wrong. Then, after thorough examination, we can choose which to consume, what is good and what is beneficial, fully appraised of the consequence of the alternative. For example, in goddamn religion, I exposed and condemned Islam, proving that the religion was a complete sham, based entirely upon what its 5 oldest scriptural sources revealed. I attacked Paul and Christianity, similarly in Twistianity. So while the information contained in those books was repulsive, demonic, and deadly, I had to thumb through the rubbish to endure the stench to do the job. However, since I was properly informed and nourished by the Torah, I did not ingest anything Satan inspired Muhammad or Paul to convey. Touching and injecting are very different in this regard. There are a number of telling insights which can be deduced from Towrah's mischaracterizations. I don't know if you've picked up on them, but the first is the most important. It is likely that Adam did an inadequate job of communicating Yahweh's instructions to her. That being the case, we ought to learn our lessons and be more diligent around those we love. Can I repeat that again? The very fact that Towrah misrepresented what Yahweh had said, it is likely that Adam did an inadequate job of communicating Yahweh's instructions to her. And that being the case, we ought to learn our lesson and be more diligent around those we love. Now, those who are looking closely may have noticed that my eyes are watering. I used eye drops before this show just because they were a bit tired and irritated, and now they're watering, and it's difficult for me to stare into all of these lights and to look into the camera, and I have a bit of a scratchy throat. So if you don't mind, I'm going to conclude this portion of the Yahowah blog here, and we will resume with episode 10 of In the Garden tomorrow. I appreciate your indulgence. Thank you so much for inviting me into your home and for listening to what Yahweh had to say, as well as the insights we can glean from it. Thank you, and good night.